Ohio 1883. The pastor who shared his fiancée with 5 members of the congregation. In the harsh winter of 1883, the small town of Millbrook, Ohio, became the stage for a scandal that would echo through generations. Reverend Thomas Whitmore, a 42-year-old man known for his fiery sermons and imposing appearance, had announced his engagement to Eleanor Hayes, a 23-year-old woman newly arrived in town. Eleanor was an orphan from Pittsburgh, having lost her parents in a fire. Without family or resources, she found refuge in Millbrook's church, where Reverend Whitmore welcomed her with promises of protection and a dignified future. The congregation saw this engagement as a blessing, an example of Christian charity transformed into true love. But behind the closed doors of the pastoral house, a disturbing reality was taking shape. Reverend Whitmore had developed his own doctrine, a twisted interpretation of Scripture that preached absolute communion among brethren. He convinced Eleanor that their marriage would not be traditional. According to his words, Eleanor would belong not only to him but to the 5 most devoted deacons of the congregation: Jacob Miller, a 50-year-old widowed farmer; Samuel Hutchins, a 38-year-old merchant; Benjamin Cross, a 45-year-old blacksmith; Daniel Foster, a 32-year-old carpenter; and Elijah Stone, a 49-year-old landowner. The young woman, weakened by recent loss and isolated in an unfamiliar town, was manipulated through private sermons and distorted biblical interpretations. The pastor quoted passages about sharing everything in community, about renouncing individual desires in favor of the collective. He painted this situation as a sacred sacrifice, a special calling from God for her. The 5 chosen men were the church's financial pillars. All had contributed generously to the construction of the new bell tower and the renovation of the pastoral house. Whitmore convinced them that this arrangement was a divine reward for their faithfulness and generosity. Each believed they were participating in something revolutionary, a new chapter of Christianity. For 3 months, the secret was kept. Eleanor lived in the pastoral house, but on specific nights, she received visits from the deacons. A carefully crafted schedule ensured there were no encounters between the men. Each believed he had a special relationship with the pastor's fiancée, approved by the community's highest religious authority. The truth began to emerge when Martha Cunningham, the church housekeeper, noticed strange movements during the early morning hours. She observed that different men were entering and leaving the pastoral residence at unusual times. Intrigued and concerned about Eleanor, Martha decided to confront the young woman. One Sunday after service, Martha found Eleanor alone in the sacristy, her eyes red from crying. With gentleness and persistence, she got the young woman to reveal the truth. Martha's initial shock quickly transformed into determination. She knew she needed to act, but carefully, as she was dealing with the town's most powerful men. Martha first sought out Sarah Miller, wife of Jacob Miller's late brother. Sarah was a respected woman, known for her courage and sense of justice. Together, they devised a plan. They knew that confronting the pastor directly would be futile. He would use his religious authority to silence them. They needed irrefutable proof. For 2 weeks, Martha meticulously recorded the visitation schedules, noting who entered and left the pastoral house. Sarah, meanwhile, discreetly spoke with some of the deacons' wives, planting subtle doubts about their husbands' nighttime commitments. The tension grew silently. The final confrontation occurred on a freezing Wednesday in February. Sarah convened an extraordinary congregation meeting, something unprecedented, as only the pastor had this authority. But she used a loophole in the church bylaws. In cases of grave moral emergency, any founding member could call an assembly. When Reverend Whitmore and the 5 deacons arrived at the church hall that evening, they found not only the complete congregation but also Sheriff William Patterson and 2 deputies. Martha and Sarah had presented their evidence to civil authorities, ensuring the matter would be not only religious but also legal. Sarah stood before everyone and, with a steady voice, recounted the facts. Initially, there was disbelief and indignation, but when Martha presented her detailed record and Eleanor, trembling, confirmed everything through tears, silence fell over the hall like a heavy shroud. The 5 deacons tried to defend themselves by claiming they had been deceived by the pastor, that they believed they were following a legitimate doctrine. Their wives, present at the meeting, reacted with fury and humiliation. Chaos ensued, with screams, accusations, and crying reverberating through the church walls. Reverend Whitmore, realizing his empire of manipulation was crumbling, attempted one last ploy. He climbed to the pulpit and began a sermon about forgiveness and divine judgment. But this time, his words fell on deaf ears. Sheriff Patterson interrupted him, ordering him to come down immediately. For violation of moral laws and abuse of religious authority, Whitmore was arrested that very night. The 5 deacons faced devastating social consequences. 3 of them had their marriages dissolved in the following weeks. Jacob Miller lost his farm in a divorce settlement. Samuel Hutchins was expelled from the town's Merchants Association. Benjamin Cross continued working as a blacksmith, but in almost complete social isolation. Daniel Foster, the youngest of them, publicly confessed to being manipulated and asked the community for forgiveness. Although he didn't fully recover his reputation, he managed to rebuild his life in another town. Elijah Stone, the wealthiest of the group, used his influence to try to minimize the scandal, but ended up selling his properties and leaving Ohio permanently. Eleanor Hayes received support from Martha and Sarah, who helped her process the trauma and start over. With funds raised by women from the congregation, Eleanor moved to Cleveland, where she learned the seamstress trade. Years later, it was learned that she had married an honest carpenter and had 2 children, finally finding the piece that had been stolen from her. Reverend Whitmore was tried and sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud, breach of trust, and manipulation. During the trial, it was revealed that this was not his first scheme. In Indiana, years earlier, he had been expelled from another congregation for similar but less serious accusations. His ability to reinvent himself and manipulate through religion had finally met its end. Millbrook's church underwent a complete reform. A new pastor, Reverend John Matthews, was brought from another town. Matthews implemented strict rules of transparency and collective oversight, ensuring that no religious leader would have absolute power again. The case echoed throughout the state of Ohio and beyond. Newspapers in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and even New York published articles about the Millbrook pastor and his bizarre scheme. The scandal served as a warning to other communities about the dangers of unchecked religious authority and psychological manipulation in the name of faith. Martha Cunningham became a respected figure, frequently invited to speak at other churches about community vigilance and protection of the vulnerable. Sarah Miller helped found one of the first women's support organizations for abuse situations in the region. Decades later, when the last survivors of that winter of 1883 were already elderly, the case was still remembered in Millbrook as a dark example of how faith can be perverted by unscrupulous individuals, but also how the courage of 2 women can challenge power structures and bring justice to the oppressed. The story of Reverend Whitmore remains as a timeless reminder. True faith requires transparency, humility, and respect for the dignity of each person.